When love is stronger than death. The Shadow Man, Hero 1, was walking through the hematite corridors, which are very mirror-like, and he's a shadow, and it interfered with the light that's in him, and it made him feel funny, and it was awkward. But he walked up to where Fallon's room was, and the war had been going very badly. The king had been turned into a zombie. His son Keb, the school had been attacked, and Keb had been put into the tower for safekeeping. And she was his supposed older sister, and she was regent over Falconland. She was about 20 years old. She'd heard bad news after bad news after bad news, and when she saw the Shadow Man coming, she just knew it was more bad news. He always looked stern and composed and sad, but she couldn't see the lines and the detail in him because he was just a shadow to her, so she couldn't see that he was smiling and that he was actually very pleased. So where have you been? I've been in Owland, on the shore. I saw an amassing of troops. Really? How many? About 2.5 alphabets, 1,000 per letter. They were in formation. They were 10 wide and 100 long. They were belts with a loop, and they run a cord 100 long through the 10 ranks and then 10 wide, and then they latch them down onto rafts, and they push the rafts into the current so at the right time and place so that they end up on the Falconland shore where they attack. There were tens of thousands of them all standing in line in blocks ready to be tied down to their respective rafts. Then the oddest thing happened. I was standing slightly behind one particular small skeleton that, as they were marching other groups of thousands into place, she noticed something. She noticed someone, and she began looking and pushing past and looking around, and she broke formation, which never happens. And then she yelled out at the top of her lungs, "George! George! I love you!" And she began pushing her way through zombies and skeletons, pushing them out of her way, fighting through and yelling, "George! George! I love you!" From the other end, he heard her, and he turned, and he was dazed, he was confused. She had to yell 5 or 6 times before the enchantment confusion fell off of him. And Dawn recognized in his eyes, "Lyda! Lyda! I love you!" And he began pushing through zombies and skeletons and pushing his way through the crowd. And this caused like extreme chaos. There were every time they yelled "I love you" and each other's names, there's something about it that caused the spell to break, and thousands of zombies and skeletons just fell into dust, and their spirits left, and others ran into the woods, and some were confused and just lay huddling and shaking, and everybody broke formation. The owls formed around trying to cast spells back on them, but it was no good, and it took hours before the dragon got there, or maybe an hour. He flew in, and the skeletons that were still there tried to put themselves back in formation, and he flew right up to the couple that were holding onto each other with bony arms and pressing their bare foreheads against each other, and he breathed fire on them. Nothing happened. It just swirled around him, and he roared at him, but they didn't seem to hear him. And he tried to swat at him, but he couldn't get close enough to him. There was something about him he couldn't stand. Finally, he gave up in defeat, and he just changed form into a man and looked around, and there were hardly any zombies or skeletons left in formation. There were maybe 6 out of 1,000 left at this point. The couple were standing there saying things like, "I remember the farm, I remember our daughter, I remember, I love you," and things like that. And then George said, "I want to go home." And she said, "Me too." And their bones clattered into a pile and their spirit left. I followed it. I could see where it was going, and I had to swim hard through the air to follow them. But I swam through the air all the way across the sea and followed them to their farm, which is about 80 miles north of here. Fallon said, I want to see where they live. I want to go there. Take me there." She walked into something that looked like a closet. She pulled back the door and stepped in, and the shadow man and stood on the small platform with her, and she pulled a lever, and a counterweight dropped, and as fast as that counterweight could drop, she shot towards the roof of this tall tower, maybe a quarter mile in the sky. And then with a jolt, they stopped at the top. And she stepped out, and at the top of this tower was a rough-legged red hawk, and it surveyed her coldly. She was already wearing riding boots, but she pulled a polished cherry red saddle out of a closet, out of a tack box, and cinched it to her falcon, and put on a leather helmet and leather armor, and climbed up onto her falcon, and the shadow man clung to her back. He gave her directions with hand signals as they flew. Let me back up. They dropped out of the window, and the falcon swooped up, and by the time they were raising altitude again, they were already on the other side of the river, and they could look down and see the dark forest of the labyrinth underneath them, and then farmland. And it was evening. It was, the sun was setting. They flew fast, and they got to where they were going in about an hour, and the sun had just set. And it was a sad place. The farmhouse looked like a skeleton. The eyes, the windows were like empty eye sockets. The barn was sad and silent. The only thing on the farm that made any noise was the windmill. It just squeaked and churned. But the garden was full of weeds, and the crops were empty, and Fallon was very sad that this place was dead, and that these people were gone, ripped from their lives. The shadow man walked into the farmhouse, and Fallon followed, and they stood there, and there was almost perfectly dark inside the house, and Fallon was just overwhelmed with a sense of despair and hopelessness and sadness. And the shadow man could sense this, and he said, "You're looking with your eyes and not with your heart. Close your eyes and lift your palms up and feel." She did this, and immediately the despair left her, and she could feel a sense of love and a blessing and a hope and a joy in the place. She could felt a hope in a knowledge that someday someone else would come and live here, and the spirit of love would wrap itself around them and give them the strength and the joy and the love to be happy in this place.